Okay. I want to thank the organizers for putting me on at the end of a very long day, and especially for putting me on right after another retired CAW guy who's got the same frustrations as I have. And I guess if we can summarize what's happened so far today, it might be summarized by saying things are going to get a lot worse before they get worse. I'm going to kind of follow up, I think, on what Herman said and talk about labor. But I want to start with something that Greg raised, because I think it's really important, and it seems kind of obvious, and I don't think we do enough of it. I think we have to think about this crisis and say, what does this crisis actually mean historically? Whenever there's a crisis, something changes, a whole series of things change, and I think we have to try to come to grips with what's different about this crisis. Is it just one of those crises that things just continue, or has something changed? So for example, if you looked at the crisis of the 60s and 70s, what changed was that globalization was accelerated, finance was liberalized, the state was restructured so it had more autonomy from the people, but was actually stronger in terms of supporting accumulation, and labor was broken. That's what happened in the coming out of the 60s and 70s crisis, and that actually has a lot to do with the nature of the crisis we're in right now. And how we're coming out of this crisis, I mean, one of the interesting things is that there's no challenge to globalization and free trade. That's kind of amazing. Last time we had a crisis that's deep in the 30s, we had protectionism. We had the protectionist scare. This time we're just kind of floating through it. Finance, I think there's some interesting things happening in finance. Not positive from our perspective, but they really are developing the capacities to manage a volatile financial system. And I just want to say something about that, because often, and I think Jim did that this morning too, we talk about finance as if it's separate from the rest of capitalism. And it isn't. The point is that finance and industry are completely integrated. There's no conflict between them. There was no conflict between them over free trade. And the reason that it's important is because it helps you understand one of the great contradictions that's going on right now, which is that industry needs finance. It needs financial services. It doesn't need it as credit. They've got all the profits they need. But they need the financial services of finance if you're going to operate globally in different countries with different exchange rates in the face of uncertainty. So their dilemma is, on the one hand, they'd like finance to be more orderly. They don't like it being completely crazy, but they don't want to regulate it to the point that they lose the advantages that global finance has offered them in terms of low interest rates, in the States especially, in terms of access to global finance. So they're trying to balance, not regulating too much so that you lose its advantages for capital, and yet regulating enough so you don't have these kinds of crazy volatility. The state, as Greg emphasized, has become more authoritarian, a very important change. It's getting more autonomy from the people to do what's necessary for capital accumulation. And the most important thing is what's happened in labor. And I just want to go back, again, historically, on the labor question. The first defeat of labor wasn't actually in the 70s. The first defeat of labor was after the war, when the left was defeated. Now, in spite of that defeat, trade unionism was able to make gains, real gains. But because the left was defeated, there were capacities that were lost, so that when things changed and there was an attack on labor, there wasn't the capacity to resist. So the second defeat was really the defeat of trade unionists, especially in the private sector, after the 70s, through the 80s and 90s. Now what they're doing is going after the public sector. The part of the labor movement that is still standing, and this is what they're going after. Now we have to appreciate the extent of this defeat. And Herman got into it. And I really want to emphasize the extent of the defeat. I mean, first of all, we just see it in terms of, yeah, labor's been defeated through the 80s and 90s, but suddenly we have this crisis, which you think, now we're really going to be on the offensive. Now we're really going to get them. Now they're really delegitimated. And it is stunning. It is absolutely remarkable how they got away with it and how we couldn't take advantage of it, and that labor is the one that's on the defensive. I mean, this is absolutely stunning, and we really have to come to grips with this. Second aspect of this defeat is the extent to which expectations get lowered. I mean, now just hanging on to most of what you have is a good thing. Now, a few years ago, suddenly looked great. Moroni looks good in contrast to what's happening today. I mean, this is a serious defeat in terms of expectations. You see it in terms of what Herman was talking about. You know, the question of, well, why isn't the CAW doing these obvious things that it did before? It actually took over Caterpillar once before. Well, you know, it's a reflection of the defeat and what happens to the culture of the movement and how it thinks what's possible. It's not just, there's a fatalism out there. You know, you talk to any worker and you don't have to convince them that capitalism doesn't work for them. They believe that. They just don't think you can do anything about it. So it's not a matter of having another ideology or another vision or wonderful arguments. Workers don't believe you can do anything about it. And that includes tactics. They've really narrowed their range of what kind of tactics are legitimate and might work. And this is what you see with the CAW. The effect of that defeat and of losing these kinds of capacities to fight back, but not just the capacities to fight back, to even think in terms of fighting back, the effect on confidence. Okay. Now, I don't think that the problem is, I mean, there are problems we've always had in the labor movement, and they're legitimate problems that really have to be discussed in terms of bureaucracy and the lack of democracy, etc. I don't think those are the key problems that we have today. I think, you know, as Steve said, in terms of populism, you can have a very militant and democratic union that's very particularist. Militant particularism, as David Harvey called it, where people say, yeah, we're going to be very militant, we want our union not to do anything but defend us. And that's the fundamental problem of unions that has always been there. That unions as a structure were built to have a limited solidarity, to have solidarity with a limited group of workers to represent those interests. And for a while, that actually could make achievements and spread achievements elsewhere. That's what's over. The notion that we can still just look after our own is over. It's not going to be successful for us, and it can't win the battles. We need a class perspective. This is absolutely fundamental. There can be no renewal of the trade union movement unless there's a class perspective. But let me just walk through how that plays itself out in different ways. When you look at organizing, if we're going to make breakthroughs in organizing, it's going to require massive union cooperation, not unions competing with each other. And you can't have cooperation if your perspective is, how do we get those dollars for ourselves? This blocks cooperation. You have to think in terms of, we have to build a class. If we don't build a working class, we're finished. And if you have a class perspective, then you can start finding the resources, the energy, the commitment, the volunteerism to actually pull it off and have the cooperation. Same goes when you look at bargaining. We're just looking at what's happening in QP bargaining. I mean, if QP keeps thinking of this in terms of we're bargaining with an employer, what should our tactics be? They will perpetually get killed. They're bargaining with the state. And a local, like Local 416, isn't going to win against the state. At a minimum, there should have been a QP strategy, which could then lead to a larger labor movement strategy. And by a QP strategy, I mean, for one thing, you don't put the municipal workers, the garbage workers up front. If you want to set standards, you would be going with the library workers who are popular. You'd actually have some coordinated bargaining. And for another thing, you'd start thinking about different kinds of strategies. Maybe what we need to do is to have selective strikes, rotating strikes. Maybe we have to really show them that if they take us on, we'll disrupt the city. And it also applies in the private sector. We've been talking about pensions and how we overcome intergenerational divides. We're not going to overcome any intergenerational divides if unions are negotiating two-tier contracts. The first thing you're doing is alienating the young workers who are allegedly one day going to renew the union. You're not going to give them you're not going to have two-tier wage agreements where you make them inferior citizens and say, by the way, we want you to support pensions for the older guys. So we have to think about that in class terms. In the public sector, the only way you can have renewal in the public sector is if the public sector gets over this question of being isolated. And that doesn't involve better PR. It doesn't mean putting up some billboards. It doesn't mean resolutions at conventions that say we love the services. It means demonstrating it. The public is cynical. They see that as opportunism unless you're out there really leading it. And what leading it means is actually changing everything about how the public sector unions are structured, everything about what they do. For example, it would mean thinking about something like, Why don't we in bargaining, which I think would have been possible with Local 416, say, our only demand is actually to keep the service in public hands. It means that you actually say, we're going to put the question of services on the bargaining table, something that unions don't do, and something if you start doing, you have to change what your staff does, what your training is, how you relate to the community, how you relate to your members. It's a whole different strategy once you do that. You'd have to start doing things like, and this is actually starting to happen in some of the engineering unions. They've actually been thinking about this, which is exciting, and it's happening in some of the officer unions. You have to actually think about whistleblowing. Instead of unions defending the state as good, which it isn't always good, you actually expose the state when it's bad. You show that you're actually representing the public and defending it. For the private sector, there can't be any union renewal until we deal with the question of jobs. As long as workers are nervous about their jobs and scared about their jobs, they're going to be giving up things in order to protect their jobs. And the problem is that, what do unions do? They negotiate the sale of your labor power. They don't deal with jobs. Now, to deal with jobs in a serious way means a couple of things. First of all, Toby flagged one crucial thing. We have to actually say the private sector is openly declaring that it can't provide decent jobs for everybody. It's openly saying that it can't do that. It's not doing the investments in spite of getting all the profits they could possibly want. If there's going to be jobs, it's going to be done through the public sector. And it's going to mean the public sector actually moving into what used to be the private sector. Not just going to mean healthcare. It also means that we don't get trapped into, when General Motors or the auto industry is in a crisis, declaring, well, we're dependent on them, so let's support subsidies. You cannot build alliances if when other people are cut back, you're lobbying for subsidies for General Motors. And second of all, it isn't going to save your jobs, because productivity in the auto industry keeps going. The auto industry is going to get smaller. It isn't a great strategy to say we need to build more cars. But there's enormous productive capacities in all those parts plants. They can make anything. We should be talking about, instead of closing them, they should be converted to useful things. And to start with the environment, not because it's a green environmental strategy, but the reality is if you take the environment seriously, everything in society is going to be changed in the future. In every factory, in every home, in all the infrastructure, everything. Why aren't we talking about that? There's a whole material thing that has to change. So you have to start talking about planning. We have to start using words like planning instead of competition. We have to start talking about social use, not profit. A lot of this we don't have the capacity to actually win, but we can only build it if we start having that kind of discussion and attacking them, as Herman was trying to emphasize. We have to talk about the banks. We can't just complain about them and yell about them. We have to actually say, in a democratic society, how come they have so much control over our lives? And if they're treated like utilities, as soon as they get into public utilities, as soon as they get into trouble, why aren't they democratic public utilities all the time? Now, it's not just an ideological thing, it's a practical necessity. If we really want to convert industry, if we really want to defend the public sector, we're going to have control over finance. If we don't, they'll discipline us. We just don't have that choice. If we want different policies, you have to change the power structure. Well, in Canada especially, finance is an important part of the power structure. You'd have to take on finance. Now again, it's not a question of if we announce it tomorrow, it'll happen. But if you don't announce it tomorrow, it'll never happen. You have to start educating people and making the links, even if you can't do it immediately. And it does raise other questions, which I'll come back to. I think the critical question in all of this isn't just a failure of the labor movement, it's a failure of the left. It's the crisis in the left. And these two things go hand in hand. And I would argue, this might be controversial, but I would argue that we will not see a renewal of the labor movement unless there's also simultaneously a renewal of the left. We are not going to see, that capacity just doesn't, the labor leadership, for all the reasons that it hasn't led radical change before, radical change is even scarier today. Stability is even more important. It is not going to come from the top, and the rank and file is too fragmented, too overwhelmed to expect them to do this unless they have a lot of resources. And those resources come from a left that can begin to link them. So what might a left do, if we're imagining what a left might be fighting for? What we should have today, given what's going on, is fight back committees in every single local. Fight back committees that are educating their own members and establishing links to the community. We should have unions, and this is actually happening now. A number of locals in the CAW, in the machinists, in QP Airlines, have started forming solidarity paths. Instead of waiting for our leadership to do something, let's decide. Just meet regularly with other locals, so you're not isolated, which is the key thing, and start talking about how can we do something collectively. When you're under attack, we're going to be there because that's our fight. And how do we get resources for that, like having a bus that will move people around, which Local 966 from QP does, and 4116 is actually discussing it. We're going to have to take on some massive organizational breakthrough, like home care workers. There's 70,000 home care workers in this province who do exactly the same work that the institutions do, except it's low-paid women, generally immigrant women, doing it. What would it mean to do this? Now, one of the things it means is you'd actually have to get unions cooperating to do this. One of the things we put on the agenda is the Greater Toronto Workers' Assembly. And our thinking is that, look, in the 1930s, what came out of that crisis? A new form of working class organization. The form of organization that the working class had at that point in time was inadequate to what they faced, and there was an explosion of industrial unionism. Now we have a crisis as deep as the 30s, and the question is, what else is going to come up? We have to really ask whether unions in their present form, which aren't going to die, they're not going to go away, they'll have their occasional wildcat, they'll have their occasional militancy, but they are inadequate to what we face today. They cannot initiate and set the agenda given what's going on. They're a defense. The question is, what other kinds of working class organizations might be formed? The Greater Toronto Workers' Assembly was an attempt to think about an intermediate form, something that was anti-capitalist, that wasn't just a coalition, that people joined because they're looking for a new kind of politics, that was class-based, that defined class very broadly. So it doesn't just include the unionized workers, it included the unemployed, low-wage, non-union workers, the poor, and that looked at every dimension of our lives, because a lot of our organizing is going to have to take place outside the workplace. So let me conclude. 3 points. First of all, one of the things we have to actually say out loud is the radical is now the only thing that's practical. If we think that just mild programs and the reforms of the past are on the agenda, they're not. Tina is right. If that's the limit of what you're going to look at, there is no alternative. The only alternative we have today is to get more radical. And that gives the left a chance to say things, because a lot of the things that the left has said are actually becoming the only thing that's practical. And related to that is we just have to think bigger, even if we want to win small. Even if you just want to defend what we have, we're going to have to think bigger, because we have to learn this lesson of the past quarter century. If we don't do it, it gets worse. It's not just a question, okay, I'll wait this through. It's going to get worse. And the final thing, which was what Herman ended on, and I really want to end on really strongly, is if we see the problem as workers feeling fatalistic, there's nothing to do, this is an organizing question. Workers aren't inherently radical, and they're not inherently conservative. It's not an essentialism to workers. They're workers. And they will change if they see that there are ways through which they can act that matter. And that's an organizing question. That's where our failure is. We haven't created structures that people can see, hey, if I work through that structure, I can change things. Unions are fading in terms of delivering that, and we haven't developed other structures. So the thing we have to come back to is a question of organizing. That's the failure of the last quarter of a century. We haven't responded, and if we don't respond, we're going to continue failing. And I don't see that as pessimistic. I see that as optimistic. That's the challenge, and if we do that, we can change things. Thank you.